Hi folks, hope you're all well out there still. Some of you may be aware that I have just migrated my website from one hosting provider to another one, and at the same time I also wanted to migrate from Drupal back to WordPress, and just because that wasn't going to be difficult enough, I thought let me also convert everything from, I was using Softaculous, the Webbuzo panel manager, which used to help you quickly install various applications by just clicking scripts, and it does the installation. Actually has been working fairly well, but one of the problems I had, especially with Drupal, was it was starting to break a lot of my, especially if I went to the command line to run drush commands or composer commands. Webbuzo creates its own PHP version and a couple of other things, so it tends to get things a bit confused sometimes, especially if you're running, as I say, from the command line. So I thought, you know what, one thing that would actually help prevent that was converting possibly to Docker containers, because essentially you're installing everything. Say like here you see WordPress, you install it with its associated database and all its dependencies and its things that it needs inside of that container, or the stack in this case. It's what I'm depicting here is a stack called WordPress, and inside it it's got a container for WordPress and a container for its related database. And this is a great theory because you can spin these things up and down quickly. Upgrade, in theory, doesn't affect your persistent files and databases. So, you just really pull a new container, start it up, and you've got an updated application. That's the theory anyway. So for me, this was a bit of a learning curve because I had been previously just basically dumping these Docker Compose files on my home network when I was doing some of this. But the new one was going to be a bit different, and the thing was I had a couple of snags because all the tutorials that I was looking at around, say here, how to install WordPress, how to install Lime Survey, how to install Nginx Proxy Manager, they just showed you how to basically pull a container and get it up and running in like 2 lines, which is great, but the problem is it really is isolated. If that's what you want, that's fine. If that's all you're going to be hosting, that's also fine. But if you're going to have, like I've got about 5 or 6 or 7 services running, they're going to end up each duplicating with their own little database running. Again, like I say, if you need to and want to keep them separate, that's fine because they are isolated, better for security, all that sort of thing. But I want to administer my databases from one service, like one phpMyAdmin, for example. So what I was looking for really was to be able to share the database across multiple installations. And I wasn't really finding any good videos that explained that conceptually as an overview. I've sort of cracked it eventually after lots of trial and error and respinning until I got it right. So I thought, you know what, let me just do a quick video, and if other people are looking for this, maybe it'll help them just understand sort of what's happening. Obviously, this is what I was aiming towards, having one phpMyAdmin, and I wanted it to see all my different databases so that I could just work on them. If I had to do any database maintenance or anything else, I could do it in one place and I could see what was coming up and so on. So that was obviously the end goal I was looking for. And conceptually, this is sort of what I'm talking about. Whereas the previous one, there was about 6 containers running. What I've done now is I've basically started up one stack called DB for database, and it's got a service called database running in, which is mariadb in my case, but you could use MySQL or PostgreSQL or whatever you want to use. As well as related in that same stack, I've got a phpMyAdmin. So I've got one phpMyAdmin which I can fire up with from its external port in the browser, and I can do whatever I need to do on the database, which has got various other databases and tables all in the same location. And then I'd have an instance, say, of WordPress, but it'll just be a WordPress stack that I'm powering up, and a Lime Survey stack and an Nginx Proxy Manager stack. They wouldn't have their own database. What they're going to do is I created a shared or user-defined network, a shared one, and I just called it, you can call it whatever you want, but I just called it mysql_db. The idea being, and that was all created when this container powers up. So this container is going to power up the database service, phpMyAdmin, and it just creates this shared network over here. Then when I create these various stacks and containers, all I'm then doing is I'm specifying there is already an external shared network. Just connect to that network and point to the shared DB. This container is called DB. So if in any of these containers I've connected them to the network, the shared network, and I've pointed it to a host name called DB, it should in effect work exactly the same as if that database was created inside that container stack. So I've done away with now all this replication of databases and that sort of thing. And yes, it's working very well. So at the moment, to externally, what happens is I'm only really exposing the Nginx Proxy Manager on port 1883, and it will point to whichever application needs to be accessed on the ports that are exposed for these containers, and they will in turn communicate internally to the database only. The database is not exposed or visible at all to the external internet. And yeah, it's working actually quite nicely. What I want to do is I will step through the compose files, the docker-compose files that I created in the end that are sort of working for me, and I'll also share them in a shared location. I'll put the link below the video if anybody else just wants to draw them and edit and work with them a little bit themselves. But ultimately what you're going to also see then is when you look at your container list in Portainer, this is Portainer that I'm using, you'll notice also I've got everything named quite cleanly, because one thing I've also noticed is if you power a stack up with say 3 containers or 1 container inside, it always prepends the stack name in front of it. So if the stack name was called NextCloud, this will be called NextCloud underscore NextCloud, and DB would be DB underscore DB. So I'll show you in the composer file how I made it just look nice and neat and tidy. You can still of course see over here what stack it belongs to, and if you drop that stack, it does shut everything down, you know, nice and cleanly. But it just cosmetically, to me, it just looked a little bit tidier. And some of them do still have some published ports. These will be the ports, obviously, that you would talk to the container. If you wanted to talk to NextCloud, you'd go to external IP address normally, 8050 in my case, and it would translate inside the container to 443. There is a little interesting quirk I'll show you just now with the Nginx Proxy Manager, but I've essentially shut these ports off from the outside world, so you have to go through the Nginx Proxy Manager to get to them. But normally, as I said, that's how you would actually, you'd just point to your individual containers if you wanted them to be exposed to the internet. So one of the advantages is that in Nginx Proxy Manager, when you set up the host, normally you would be pointing to the IP address of the container or the public IP address and the external port that you'd specify here, the 8050 for example, or 7000 or whatever. But the nice way of doing it all like this with containers is you can now actually just point to the container name. So it'll be just WordPress, for example, or if you named the other one Lime Survey, you just have Lime Survey, and you would use your internal port, the actual container's internal port, to talk to it in this manner. So if you used external IP, it's external address for the container. If you use the container name here, you can just specify the internal port, like I said there, the 443 or whatever the case is. Yeah, there was a quirk, of course, with NextCloud. I struggled quite a bit to get NextCloud to work, because I should have said this theory works 100%. I've got no problems with it. But what I've really struggled is where there were idiosyncrasies within a container or the setup of a container. So the problem with NextCloud, for example, is that it insists on generating a self-signed SSL certificate. So you can't point it from Nginx Proxy Manager to HTTP. You've got to point to HTTPS. And it had another little quirk as well with regards to its database compression. For some reason, you've got to turn the compression off. It's an issue with the latest version of MariaDB that still seems to be present. But you know, if one doesn't know that, you tend to think, oh, there's something wrong with my database shared setup. It's not working because it's not connecting to the database. Well, it was not that at all. It was actually this other little issue. So I've sort of learned now to trust that this system works and rather go and look and see what else is wrong in the container itself. You know, sometimes you've got to spin up your container 7 or 8 times, fiddling with the little settings to get it to go. But in most cases, it's going to be the creation of the container that might be a problem, not necessarily the fact that you're sharing the database in this manner. So I think, yeah, the last 2 things I really just want to show is then what does the database container look like, because that's the one, or the stack that you're going to spin up, because that's the one you need to spin up and create first. And then the second one I'm going to show by way of example is WordPress, but it is basically identical for whether it's Lime Survey or any other services. You could have 10 or 20 of these services spinning up. So this is, you'll see here, I've just called the YML file db.yml. This will be the docker-compose file that will be used to spin up and create the stack within Portainer. That's how I've been doing it. So I'll step through some of these things here. So obviously one of the services you're defining is something called DB. That's just the name then of the service. So DB will be for database, to point to it or talk to it. I've specified an image, in my case mariadb, the latest version of the image. There we've given, what I've also done here is the container name and the host name. I've also specified both as DB. This is just so, like I talked about before, it prevents that prefix appending in the front with the stack name. It just keeps it neater and tidy. You really don't have to do it. It's just a cosmetic thing. I just prefer it to look a bit tidier, but that's where I specify that to name it. Obviously a restart always. I've specified that DB will be using mysql.net. That's the name of that shared network I'm going to be creating. You can call it whatever you want. Then the environment part. So it does need to specify also what will the MySQL root password be. So you obviously use whatever you're going to want to call it. I've just given the example here, DB root password. And if you do use whatever you use, just make sure you're consistent in the other containers as well, because it needs that to connect to the database. But this will in essence create and then set the database with that root password. The volume, I've specified a volume just called DB here. And the reason for that is you want to create persistent storage. If you don't do this, whenever you shut down your container or recreate it, you've lost your database. So this is quite important. You want to specify there, first of all, the name of the volume, an external name it can be pointed to, and it'll be mapping inside the volume a path /var/lib/mysql. That'll be where the database files will be stored in that volume. Then I've specified a service here called phpMyAdmin. And I have now, interesting, this depends on also flummoxed me for quite a while. A good hour or two I was trying to understand why things weren't spinning up when I used this in my other stacks like WordPress. I was also putting in there depends on DB. I was assuming, but it'll just see DB or not, and you know, it'll work or it won't work. But it kept saying it wasn't seeing, kept saying it wasn't seeing, until I discovered later on it seems like this depends on command only works within the same stack. So in other words, if you'd had WordPress down here at the bottom also created together all in the stack, then depends on will be working fine, but it does not work across the different stacks and external containers. So it's fine to include it in this stack, but it's not going to work. You won't see it in the other ones I've got. Then yes, I've specified the image we're pulling, another restart always. I've also specified here, this will use the network mysql-net. I've specified again the name for the container name and the host name, just so we don't have that prependix. Ports, okay, in this case, because I will be accessing phpMyAdmin in my browser, I have specified ports to be accessed or to be published, and it will be publishing port 7000 externally, but you can use to access, and on the internal side, it'll be using port 80 within the container itself. So this is just important to note. If you're going to be, like I said, mapping through Nginx Proxy Manager, remember if you're using IP address, it'll be 7000. If it's the container name you want to specify, then you'll be using 80. On the environmental side for phpMyAdmin, I'm telling it what the host database is going to be, and it'll basically just point to DB. That'll be that other service that'll be running in its container. So that establishes that link. I've also specified what the MySQL root password is, the same as the one that was specified in the database. Otherwise, again, they won't connect. And I've also stipulated an upload limit, because I think the default is something like 2 kilobytes or 10 kilobytes or something like that. So I've just specified a slightly bigger limit so that I can import bigger MySQL database files. Then the creation takes place here at the bottom, and essentially we've only talked about one volume that was created up here in the database service. So all I've said here is create a database DB, but I've also said name DB again. That again just stops that prepending of the stack name in front of it. Then network, this is where we create that shared network. So I've specified networks, create a network called mysql-net, and again just give it a name, otherwise it's going to prepend the stack name. And I suppose this makes sense, you know, if you've got separate networks, separate, you know, keeping them separate for each. But in this case, no, you don't want to. You want to have a shared network running between your database and your 2 or 3 or 4 other containers that make use of it. Remember, if your container doesn't need a database, you won't be linking to database and you won't have to worry about adding this network side. So this running this now as creating a stack within Portainer is going to essentially create your database and your phpMyAdmin and this shared network. So let's go on and have a look then at a typical example of what the application service stack will look like when it's created. So I've got the example here now set of WordPress. WordPress normally would have its service defined as WordPress, and then down here underneath it would have another DB for the database or whatever else you wanted to run. So you'll notice there's no database. Under services, there's just WordPress. I've pulled the image name. I've set the container and host name again to just WordPress. Got to restart always. Now here I've defined what network to use. If you don't define a network, first of all, it's not going to see that shared network. And secondly of all, it's just going to use the standard bridge network, which is not going to allow the sharing. So I'm specifying here networks, and I'm using the name that I used to create that shared network, mysql-net. I'm also specifying ports because WordPress, you want to access WordPress again in a browser to manage it or to share it publicly and so on. As far as WordPress is concerned, we'll be sharing port 8080 with the public IP address in order to reach it. Or, as I said, if you're going to be using Nginx Proxy Manager with the name of this container, which is WordPress, you'd have WordPress and 80, which is the internal port for the container. Then under environment settings, the couple of settings you do have to set for WordPress is of course pointing to the database. So in this case, where we've got WordPress DB host, I am specifying DB. So it will find the container called DB and connect to it. WordPress database user. Now again, I am just for sake of simplicity here using the MySQL root user and password, but there's nothing stopping you here creating a user, for example, called WordPress and a unique password for it. Just remember though that you need to go and then create that user and password in that database before you spin up this container. And here is the WordPress database name. You can again call it anything. I've just defaulted it to WordPress. The important thing here as well is you go in with that phpMyAdmin and you go and just create an empty database called WordPress. That's it. You don't have to put any tables or anything else inside it, but just make sure that's created first. If you had the root whatever password, you wouldn't have to do anything. But if you did have a unique user here set with a password, remember you'd also have to just in that database just go and create that user and password as well. That's all you have to really do. Then as far as WordPress goes itself, we also needed to specify some persistent data storage so that again if we recreate this container, the data on your website and all your stuff is still there. So I create a volume called WordPress, and inside it, it'll be mapping inside the container with /var www.html. That's where within the container it would expect to find its WordPress files and so on. Then the only other two things you need to spec within the service you're spinning up for WordPress is create the volumes. So in other words, we just got one volume in this case, so it'll just be called WordPress, and I've forced the name again to as WordPress, and the network. Now the difference here though is that you're not creating the network. So this external true means that it's an external already existing network, so don't go and create a new one. It needs to find this network, and you'll basically repeat this in any other containers that need to share to the database. You'll just use whatever the name is, external true, and again I've just forced the name. I don't even think that is actually necessary, but just to keep everything consistent and clean. And that really is it. Obviously you want to keep the database container running most of the time, or you want to keep it running actually, because the reason is this needs to find it to connect. So I can, if that database is running, I can recreate this at any time or update it or do whatever I need to do. The key things really to remember, as I said, were the fact that the network will be specifying an external existing network that's already there, and where there is database details, you would need to specify the actual container name for the database, and if you've got unique users and a database name. And just remember to create the database before you create the new container. I've put in a whole lot of comments as well that could maybe just help people. But I hope, look, I hope this is not going to mean much, I suppose, to advanced Docker users. This is probably old hat to them, but it's just something that I found I couldn't really find it explained clearly anywhere. So I do hope this helps other newbies with Docker to at least get this part of it sorted out. There's a lot of lessons to be learned within each container still, but so far it's been a lot of fun, and yeah, I'm enjoying, and I'm looking forward to sort of expanding my Docker setup a little bit more. But as I said, yeah, thanks very much. I hope you found it of some interest, and I will see you in my next video.